Billionaire CEO's world stopped as he watched himself on the news. The evening news flickered across a dozen screens in the sleek, glass-walled penthouse overlooking the glittering city. Richard Hale stood motionless before the largest monitor, a tumbler of bourbon forgotten in his hand. At 52, he had everything the world measured success by: wealth that could buy nations, influence that moved markets, respect that commanded rooms. Yet the penthouse echoed with a silence so profound it felt like a living thing, breathing coldly against his skin. Before we go deeper, let me ask you, do you believe a single moment can shatter everything someone thought they knew about their life? Tell me in the comments before the story unfolds. Drop your thoughts below. Whose side would you stand on when truth collides with power? And now, the news anchor's voice cut through the stillness. A truly inspiring story. 14-year-old Ethan Cole has just been awarded the National Youth Innovation Prize for his groundbreaking work in sustainable energy technology. Richard's eyes lifted to the screen, and the world stopped. The boy standing at the podium was thin, with unruly dark hair, and a hesitant smile that seemed almost apologetic for the attention. But it was the eyes that froze Richard's breath in his chest. Deep-set, intelligent, burning with a quiet fire that asked questions before speaking them aloud. Richard knew those eyes. He'd seen them every morning in the mirror for 40 years. The bourbon slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of glass and amber liquid. He didn't notice. Ethan credits his mother, Clara Cole, for encouraging his curiosity. The anchor continued. Clara. The name punched through him like a physical blow, dragging memories from the depths where he'd tried to drown them for 14 years. The flashback washed over him in waves of bittersweet agony. 14 years ago, Richard had been different younger, still believing ambition and happiness could coexist. His father's empire loomed over him like a shadow he couldn't escape, but in the small apartment next door lived a light that made the darkness bearable. Clara Evans had moved in on a Tuesday, carrying paint-stained boxes and humming something soft and wordless. She looked at him not as Richard Hale, heir to billions, but as simply Richard, a man who sometimes forgot to eat when he worked late, who loved terrible action movies, who laughed like he'd forgotten how and had to relearn each time. Their love had grown in stolen moments, late-night conversations on the fire escape, shared takeout from the Thai place downstairs, her fingers tracing constellations across his shoulder blades in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd painted him once, capturing something in his expression he'd never seen in any photograph: vulnerability, hope, a gentleness his father had spent decades trying to eliminate. "You're going to change the world," she'd whispered one night, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, a secret they'd shared for only 3 days. "We're going to change it," he'd corrected, kissing her forehead, his hand covering hers. 2 weeks later, she was gone. No note, no explanation, no trace, except an empty apartment and a phone number that rang endlessly into the void. Richard had torn his life apart searching, had hired investigators, had called hospitals and shelters and anyone who might have seen her. Nothing. His parents had consoled him with that particular coldness that wealthy people mistake for strength. She clearly wasn't stable enough for this life, his mother had said, adjusting her pearls. Better you discovered this now. Heartbroken and drowning, Richard had done what Hales always did. He'd buried himself in work, transforming grief into corporate conquests, letting ambition calcify over the wound until he almost believed it had healed. Almost. Richard replayed the news segment 17 times that night, studying every angle of Ethan's face, listening to the cadence of his voice, searching for confirmation of what his heart already knew as absolute truth. At 6 a.m., he called his executive assistant. "Jennifer, I need you to find information on someone. Discreetly. A woman named Clara Evans, possibly now Clara Cole. She has a 14-year-old son named Ethan. I need to know where they live, how they're living, everything." "Sir?" Jennifer's voice held careful neutrality, trained never to question, but unable to completely hide her surprise. "Please, Jennifer, it's personal." The word felt foreign in his mouth. Richard Hale didn't do personal. He did strategic, calculated, profitable. Personal was the luxury of people who hadn't learned that attachment was just another weakness to be exploited. The report arrived within 6 hours. Clara Evans Cole ran a small art studio in Greenfield, a modest suburb 40 minutes from the city. She taught painting classes to children and local adults, barely making enough to cover rent and Ethan's school expenses. She'd never married. She lived quietly, almost invisibly, as if afraid of drawing attention. Richard stared at her address until the numbers blurred, his chest constricting with an emotion he couldn't name. Guilt, rage, longing, all twisted together into something that tasted like rust and regret. But the report raised more questions than it answered. Why had she left? Why had she never told him about Ethan? And why, after all these years, did the boy carry her last name and not his? He needed more answers. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. Marcus Chen, a private investigator who specialized in cases requiring absolute discretion. "I need you to look into something for me," Richard said. "But Marcus, I need you to dig deep. 14 years deep." 3 days later, Marcus sat across from Richard in the penthouse, a manila folder resting on the table between them like an unexploded bomb. "You're not going to like this," Marcus said quietly. "Tell me." Marcus opened the folder, extracting a series of bank records, legal documents, and signed statements. 14 years ago, your parents' attorney arranged a meeting with Clara Evans. Your mother was present. Richard's jaw tightened. "Go on." "They knew about the pregnancy. They'd had her followed after you started seeing her." Marcus slid a photograph across the table. Clara, younger, leaving a doctor's office, her hand protectively cradling her stomach. They offered her money, a lot of it, enough to disappear and raise the child comfortably, but only if she left immediately and never contacted you again. The room tilted slightly. Richard gripped the armrest of his chair, knuckles white. "She took the money. She refused it," Marcus said softly. "Multiple times. They threatened her instead. Said they'd ensure she never worked as an artist again. That they'd tie her up in custody battles she couldn't afford to fight. That they'd destroy her reputation and make sure she lost the child entirely." Richard felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure opening into a chasm of rage so deep it had no bottom. They threatened her. Your mother told her that if she really loved you, she'd understand that she was an obstacle to your destiny, that you had a path carved out, and she was derailing it, that the kindest thing she could do was vanish. Marcus paused, his expression pained. "There's a recording. Your parents kept it as insurance, I guess. Do you want to hear it?" "Yes." Marcus pressed play on his phone. Clara's voice emerged, younger but unmistakable, trembling with barely contained tears. "I love him. I would never hurt him." His mother's voice followed, cold as January steel. "Then prove it. Leave. Give him the chance to become what he's meant to be. or stay and watch us destroy you both. The choice is yours, Miss Evans, but make it quickly. Time is money, after all." A long silence, then Clara's broken whisper. "If I go, you'll leave him alone? You won't tell him I took money or paint me as someone terrible? We'll simply tell him you left. Young love rarely survives reality anyway." The recording ended. Richard sat in stunned silence, his breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Rage white, hot, and all-consuming flooded every cell of his body. But beneath it, deeper and more terrible, was grief. Grief for the woman who'd been forced to choose between her dignity and her love. Grief for the son who'd grown up without a father. Grief for the life they could have had, stolen by people who believed love was weakness and control was care. If you were Clara, young, alone, and threatened, would you have stayed and fought or disappeared to protect your child? I'm curious what you would choose. Subscribe and like. Also, share your answer in the comments. Your perspective adds depth to this story. "They're both dead now," Marcus said quietly, as if reading Richard's thoughts. "Your parents, 5 years ago, heart attack and stroke, respectively." "I know," Richard whispered. He'd barely mourned them, had felt guilty for his lack of grief. Now he understood why. He stood abruptly, walking to the window, staring out at the city his family had helped build a monument to ambition and ruthlessness, glittering and hollow. "Find out where Clara's art studio is," he said, his voice rough. "I need to see her." "Richard." Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure? It's been 14 years. Maybe they stole everything from us." Richard interrupted, his reflection ghostly in the window. "Time, choice, truth. I can't get those years back, but I can stop hiding from what they did." Richard parked 3 blocks away, his hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Greenfield was nothing like the gleaming towers of the city. It was tree-lined streets and small shops, neighbors who knew each other's names, the kind of place where life moved at a human pace instead of a corporate one. Clara's art studio occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone, its window displaying vibrant paintings, abstract swirls of color, delicate portraits, landscapes that seemed to pulse with light. A hand-painted sign read Evans Art Studio in warm, golden letters. Through the window, Richard could see them. Clara stood at an easel, demonstrating brush techniques to a small class of children. She'd changed, her dark hair showed threads of silver now, and fine lines creased the corners of her eyes, but she was still unmistakably her. Still graceful, still radiant, still possessing that quality of focused attention that made whoever she looked at feel like the only person in the universe. And beside her, helping a younger child mix colors, was Ethan. The boy was gentle with the little girl, patient and encouraging, showing her how to blend blue and yellow into green. When she accidentally knocked over a water jar, he just laughed and grabbed paper towels, turning the mishap into a joke that made her giggle instead of cry. Richard's vision blurred. This was his son, this kind, brilliant boy who'd grown up without him, who'd learned gentleness from a mother forced to flee, who'd thrived despite everything that had been stolen from him. Clara glanced toward the window suddenly, and for one heart-stopping moment, their eyes met. Recognition flashed across her face, shock, then fear, then something harder to read. She turned away quickly, but her hand had gone to her throat, a gesture Richard remembered from when she was nervous. He drove away before she could come outside, his chest aching with a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. Richard couldn't approach her directly, not yet. The wound was too raw, the history too complicated. But he could help. He had to do something. 2 weeks later, Clara received a letter from the Greenfield Arts Council informing her that she'd been selected for a solo exhibition at the city's Contemporary Art Museum. The exhibition would be fully funded by an anonymous benefactor, with all proceeds going to her. Clara stared at the letter for a long time, her hands trembling. She knew. She called the Arts Council, her voice steady but cold. "I appreciate the opportunity, but I can't accept. Please thank the benefactor for their generosity and rescind the offer." The coordinator sounded baffled. "Miss Cole, this is a significant opportunity. Most artists would one. I'm not most artists." Clara interrupted gently. "Thank you, but no." When Richard received the news, he wasn't surprised. Clara had always been proud, had always valued her independence. It was one of the things he'd loved most about her, her refusal to be defined by others' expectations. But it also meant she wouldn't make this easy. He sent one more thing, a single letter, delivered to her studio late one evening, unsigned. "Clara, I never knew. If I had known, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. They kept the truth from me, and I will never forgive them for what they took from us. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just need you to know that every day for 14 years, I wondered where you were. And now that I know, I wonder if you can ever believe that I would have chosen you. I would have chosen both of you. Always." Clara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth to muffle the sobs. Ethan was asleep upstairs, and she couldn't let him hear her breaking apart over ghosts he didn't know existed. She'd spent 14 years building a life from the ashes of the one she'd lost. She'd been strong, had refused to be a victim, had raised their son to be kind in a world that valued cruelty. But God, it had been hard, so impossibly hard. And now Richard knew, and everything she'd carefully constructed felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards in a rising wind. Clara appeared at Richard's office on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced. His secretary tried to stop her, but something in Clara's expression made the woman step aside. Richard looked up from his desk, and time collapsed. They stood there, 7 feet and 14 years between them, both older, both scarred, both carrying the weight of everything unsaid. "You found out," Clara said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Richard nodded, not trusting his voice. She stepped further into the office, her arms crossed protectively. "Your parents told you I left, that I just disappeared. I searched for you," Richard said hoarsely, "for months, years. I thought—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He'd thought so many terrible things, that she'd been hurt, that she'd never loved him, that he'd imagined the connection between them. "They threatened me," Clara said, and Richard heard the carefully controlled anger beneath her calm. "They said they'd take Ethan from me, that they'd destroy any chance I had of making a living as an artist, that they'd make sure you believed I was just a gold digger who got pregnant on purpose. Clara, I was 23, Richard, 23 and pregnant and terrified. I didn't have family with money or lawyers or connections. I had a studio apartment and student loans and a baby growing inside me. They knew exactly which buttons to push." Her voice cracked slightly. "They told me, if I really loved you, I'd let you have the life you were meant for, without me dragging you down." Richard crossed the space between them in 3 strides, his hands reaching for her but stopping short, afraid he'd break whatever fragile courage had brought her here. "You never dragged me down." You were the only thing that made that life bearable." "I know that now," Clara whispered, "but I was so scared then, and so tired of being told I wasn't enough. You were everything." The words came out broken, jagged with grief. They stood there, the air between them thick with 14 years of loss and longing, and the terrible knowledge that some things, once broken, can never be fully repaired. "Ethan," Richard said finally, "can I don't expect anything, but can I at least know him?" Clara's expression shifted, protective instinct flaring in her eyes. "He's happy, Richard. He has a good life. Simple, maybe, by your standards, but good. He doesn't know about you, doesn't know about any of this." "I wouldn't disrupt that," Richard said quickly. I've missed 14 years. I can't get those back. But maybe I don't have to miss everything." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for something, sincerity perhaps, or proof that he wouldn't hurt the boy she'd sacrificed everything to protect. "He's not a project," she said finally. "He's not an heir to be groomed or a trophy to be displayed. He's a kind, thoughtful, brilliant boy who likes terrible science fiction movies and makes pancakes on Sunday mornings and worries about whether sea turtles are okay. He sounds perfect," Richard whispered. "He is." Clara's voice softened. "And he got all the best parts of both of us, somehow." They talked for 2 hours, carefully navigating the minefield of their shared history, building a fragile bridge across the chasm between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps, or an ending that didn't feel like complete devastation. When Clara left, Richard stood at his window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness fell, feeling something he hadn't felt in 14 years. Hope. 6 weeks later, Ethan Cole received an invitation to a special mentorship program for young innovators. The program paired award, winning students with industry, leaders who could provide guidance and support for their projects. Ethan's mentor was listed simply as R. Hale, Technology Sector. Clara had agreed to this, though her hands had trembled when she signed the permission form. Richard had promised to let Ethan set the pace, to never push, to simply be present in whatever capacity the boy was comfortable with. They met at a coffee shop near the mentorship program's office's neutral ground, nothing that would feel intimidating or corporate. Richard arrived early, his hands wrapped around a coffee he couldn't drink, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Then Ethan walked in, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking slightly nervous and impossibly young, and Richard forgot how to breathe. "Mr. Hale?" Ethan extended his hand, polite and formal. Richard shook it, marveling at how real it felt. His son's hand warm and solid and alive. "Ethan, please. Just Richard is fine. Mr. Hale makes me feel ancient." Ethan smiled, relaxing slightly. "My mom says that about Miss Cole. She says it makes her feel like a librarian." "Your mom is an artist, right?" Richard had to be careful, had to pretend he didn't know everything about Clara's life. "Yeah, she's amazing. She basically gave up her own career to make sure I had everything I needed." Ethan's expression softened with obvious affection. "She's my hero, honestly." Richard's chest tightened. "She sounds incredible." They talked for an hour, and Richard discovered that his son was everything Clara had promised. Brilliant but humble, ambitious but kind, curious about the world in a way that reminded Richard of who he'd once been, before ambition had calcified into armor. As they parted, Ethan paused. "This might sound weird, but you remind me of someone." Richard's heart stopped. "Oh, I don't know. Just something about your expressions, I guess." My mom has a painting she did a long time ago, before I was born. A portrait of someone she won't talk about. You have the same eyes as the person in that painting." Richard couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Ethan shrugged, embarrassed. "Sorry, that was random. I'll see you next week." "Yeah," Richard managed. "Next week." The mentorship continued through the autumn and into winter. Richard and Ethan met weekly, ostensibly to discuss Ethan's energy project, but increasingly just to talk. About science, about life, about dreams and fears and the infinite complexity of trying to make the world better. Richard had never been happier. Clara attended Ethan's presentation at the mentorship program's showcase event, sitting in the audience while her son explained his work to a room full of impressed professionals. She watched Richard watching Ethan, saw the naked love and pride on his face, the way he clapped louder than anyone when Ethan finished. After the presentation, the three of them stood together awkwardly in the lobby. Ethan between his parents, neither of whom he knew were his parents, all of them trapped in a secret that felt both necessary and unbearable. "You've done amazing work with him," Richard said to Clara, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "We did," Clara corrected gently. "He has your mind." "And your heart." Ethan looked between them, sensing something beneath the surface but unable to quite grasp it. "You two know each other?" "We did," Clara said carefully. "A long time ago." "Oh." Ethan processed this, then shrugged. "Cool. Small world, I guess." Richard met Clara's eyes across the space of their son's shoulder, and something passed between them. Forgiveness, perhaps, or at least the beginning of peace. Later that night, Richard stood in his penthouse, looking at the photograph he'd kept hidden for 14 years, Clara laughing on the fire escape. The city lights haloed around her head, looking at whoever held the camera like they held her whole world. He'd kept it as a punishment, a reminder of everything he'd lost. Now it felt different, not like a wound, but like a bridge connecting past and present, loss and redemption. His phone rang. Clara's name appeared on the screen. "Thank you," she said when he answered, "for respecting him, for not disrupting his life." "He's remarkable," Richard said softly. "You raised him well." "We'll tell him," Clara said, "someday when he's ready. But for now, this is enough," Richard finished. And it was. Not perfect, not whole, not anything like what they'd lost, but it was real, this fragile, hard-won connection, built on ruins and honesty, and the slow, painful work of transforming regret into something that looked almost like hope. 6 months later, Ethan's project received additional funding and recognition. He'd be attending a special summer program at MIT, pursuing his passion with the full support of mentors who believed in his potential. Richard and Clara stood side by side at Ethan's goodbye party, watching him laugh with friends, young and full of possibility, carrying the best of both of them into a future neither had imagined. "Do you regret it?" Richard asked quietly. "All of it?" Clara was silent for a long moment, then shook her head. "I regret what was taken from us. I regret the cruelty and the fear and the years apart. But I don't regret him. I could never regret him. Neither could I." They stood together, two people who'd loved and lost and somehow found a way to exist in the same space again, not as lovers, but as something else, partners in protecting and nurturing the best thing they'd ever created. Ethan caught them watching and waved, his smile bright and uncomplicated. A boy who didn't yet know his story was more complicated than he'd imagined, but whose life had been shaped by love anyway. Richard thought about his parents, about their need to control and manipulate, about how their vision of success had required destroying anything soft or real. He thought about the empire they'd built and the wasteland they'd left in their wake. Then he looked at his son, kind, brilliant, whole, and understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of the future you'd planned and embracing the messy, imperfect reality of what is. He'd lost 14 years. He couldn't change that. But he had today and tomorrow, and all the small, precious moments that add up to a life. It wasn't the story he'd imagined, but it was real, and that, Richard finally understood, was more valuable than any empire. Some truths come too late to change the past, but sometimes knowing is enough to heal what silence once destroyed. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not claim what's ours, but protect what's theirs, and find peace in the love that survives, even when everything else has been taken away. Do you think Richard deserves a second chance at being in Ethan's life? Or are some opportunities lost forever? Comment your final thoughts. I'd love to hear how you think this story should continue from here. Please subscribe and like.